Hey everybody, welcome to Geeksvana Live. I hope you're all extremely well this evening. We are tonight going to be talking about one of our slighter, deeper dives in terms of the UK CAA drone consultation. And in fact, we're going to be looking at the topic of remote ID and trying to explain what is actually coming. So we will be talking about the information contained within the consultation itself, of course. Now, it's important to try and explain that this isn't a rant video. It is intended to, although there will be some opinion, most certainly, it is intended to break down and explain what is proposed so that you have some more information on that. There is a place, in my opinion, for remote ID and a system which could work, but in fact, probably many systems out there which could work. But I don't feel necessarily that these proposals are actually ticking either of those boxes, frankly. Also, we could potentially be placing regulation against the very spirit and even the actual process, the regulatory process requirements that are actually there as well. As I say, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us in the live chat. I really appreciate it. It is good to see you. So we are going to be looking at tonight the way that the UK CAA have proposed remote ID will be happening. There's some of the technical information behind it as well, which I think is really important. Some of the things that I think are missing in terms of the understanding and in terms of actually how it will work, who it will impact, model flying and FPV in there as well, because I think that's something which often gets left out. And there are some benefits and negatives there in terms of on the FPV side of things as well, which I'll be pointing out. And I'll also be raising what I feel are some serious issues over some of the evidence put forward for this particular part of the consultation. And as I said before, that part might just end up getting a little bit spicy. We'll have to wait and see. So if you're here joining us in the live chat, do let us know your thoughts. Do tag at Geeksvana in the live chat. I've got it over here on this screen in front of me, and we will be coming back to you once we've gone through the main body of this information itself. And of course, if you are new to the channel or watching on the replay, then do hit the subscribe button and let us know down below what you think in terms of your comments. We do read every single comment that comes into the channel, and that has been tested recently. So the consultation, the first thing that is really important to mention about this consultation, that it is actually pretty heavy on remote ID. The entire 42-page document has 79 mentions of the keywords remote ID together in the document. So this really is the consultation of remote ID here in the UK. It first appears in the executive summary. Let me pull this up, which is on this part here, which is actually on page number 6. And basically here it talks about, at the beginning of the executive summary, it states, to maintain the security of our airspace, we are proposing for UAS to communicate location and identification data during the flight, so remote ID, i.e. digital number plates for UAS. Now, in terms of the technical side of things, it is stated within the market surveillance section, which starts on page 21. And it's 4.12 for this one in particular, that we are proposing to introduce a requirement on manufacturers to provide information to the MSA, the Market Surveillance Authority, on UAS product codes, make, model, and relationship to serial numbers when products are actually placed on the market. This will allow the MSA to identify the make and model of UAS from their remote message, and it will enable them to identify specific models of drone that may be involved in potential incidents and take appropriate mitigating action. Now, that's quite an important section to remember as we move through this, because there's a lot of discussion here about essentially one of the parts which is a great deal of this concerns me, but one of the parts that concerns me in particular on remote ID is there's a lot of discussion here about what remote ID will bring in terms of evidence, in terms of what's actually happening in the airspace, etc. And in terms of how good regulation is supposed to be put together, in my opinion, that's not the way round it should actually be. There should be a problem or be evidence of an issue that needs a regulation to take care of it. Now, the section I want to bring up here is the remote ID section itself, which is section number 5, which is just on the previous page there, on page 20. I believe. No, actually, no, excuse me. There we go. And it is titled, the chapter 5 is titled Safe and Secure Airspace. The introduction reads that whilst UAS provide many benefits, there are also significant safety and security impacts from negligent and deliberate misuse of UAS. This section proposes to implement remote ID for UAS, enabling UAS operators to be remotely identifiable during flight. It also proposes to use geo-awareness and geofencing functionality to protect against UAS entering restricted airspace. Collectively, these mitigations aim to prevent safety and security risks from materializing and to enable appropriate action to be taken when UAS are used maliciously. They complement our proposals in the airspace modernization, which I believe is actually CAP 1616, if anybody wants to look that up, a modernization strategy to enable safe integration of UAS into our airspace. Now, section 5, as you might expect, being talking about security and safety, is dominated by remote ID. I'm going to start here at section 5.1, which is where it says, let me just bring up to the right point here. So this is obviously explaining the basics. So remote ID is the ability of a UAS, a drone, to communicate identification and location information during flight. The requirement for remote ID already exists in UK regulation, but is yet to be implemented. The call for input described the important role of remote ID in improving the ability to identify individuals misusing UAS and in enabling enforcement. In addition, it discussed how remote ID could be implemented in practice and potential changes to the regulation. So this is explaining the basics of what remote ID is. It will be transmitting a set of information to identify you and the drone as, I suppose, legitimate air users in the airspace. So beyond your drone being tracked via the actual frequencies being put out, etc., as many drone detection systems already do, this will actually identify the drone itself down to the serial number, which of course is then tied to a person. Now, up next, we're shown an insight into the evidence, and this is a big part of it for me. A big part of the argument here. The CA, and this is the evidence they're saying the CA puts forward, which is in 5.3, which I'll bring up here and read in full. Data available to the CAA, and this paragraph has been repeated so many times across social media recently. Data available to the CAA, government and police provides conclusive evidence of the severity and scale of safety and security risks posed by the misuse of UAS. Since November 2020, police have received 18,290 reports of drone flights involving a legal, nuisance, criminal, or safety concern. In the first 9 months of 2023, reports are 10% higher than the same time last year. There is a footnote to explain, as you can see at the bottom of the page, where this evidence is sourced from. And here we have what is the first significant issue in terms of the remote ID plans, as far as I'm concerned. As it says here, data collected by the MPCC counter-drone team from police forces and other agencies up to 6th of October 2023. So obviously fairly recent, fairly relevant, you would argue there. So this does not break down or provide a link to any report that's actually relied upon. The source is one line of text. This does not meet, in my opinion, the requirements expected of a public consultation in terms of providing open and free access to the evidence on offer. I'll explain more on that in a few moments. Now, the data is also not substantiated to any degree that could possibly be seen as evidence. There is no known accepted benchmark that allows for a single line of text, which we're seeing here at the bottom, to be providing the source of reports as evidence for major regulation. It also seems to quote that 18,000 reports of drone flights involving illegal, nuisance, criminal, or safety concern. Really, my major issue here is, since when does regulation get created based on the number of calls handled by police? Well, we need a deeper dive into the facts to show how many of those calls were valid, how many of them were even followed up on, or even led to investigations and or action being taken. This is more, there's actually more of this in section 1.3 and 1.4, which goes into a little bit more detail as I jump around this form. Bear with me, page 7. And then pop down to 1.4. And again, you see here in 1.3 and 1.4, and this is the entire context within the introduction of the document. And it does state here that, however, the widespread availability of UAS has already created safety and security risks that can have widespread ramifications. Some of these risks have been widely publicized, apparently, such as UAS flying near airport runways and or in other flight restriction zones. Other risks posed by UAS are less well publicized, but are observed today by the CAA, government, and police. These include UAS used for reconnaissance of targets for criminality, transporting illegal substances into restricted sites, capturing images of sensitive sites, e.g. live crime scenes, traffic accidents, schools, or national security sites, enabling stalking and harassment, and flying dangerously, e.g. directly above traffic and or near emergency service helicopters. 1.4 moves on to again repeat this part of the data that we were just talking about that since November 2020, police have received the 18,290 reports, and in the first 9 months, police received 5,005 reports, a 10% increase over the same period in 2022. And in the 6 weeks following the 23rd of September 2023, the CAA received 558 reports of UAS operating within a flight restriction zone or outside an FRZ, but over 400 feet. And between January and October, 9 UAS have been reported as operating between 6 and 13,000 feet. But again, this has pretty limited evidence. If you look again at these parts here at the bottom, you can actually see these are essentially the links which they're relying on. So you've got the Pricewaterhouse report there, a BBC News report, and again, a couple of texts telling us that people have gathered data, but not actually linking. Although these two parts here, the news report and the PwC report, actually link, these do not. They're just basically empty boxes. Now, for more on my issue with this one section alone, I'd actually like to refer back to a document that we've been discussing on Geeksvana a few weeks ago in some detail. And this is actually the Regulators Code. This is more than just guidance for regulators within the UK. It is backed by legislation. Let me bring that up. And it actually lays out the standards that regulators must achieve in order to be able to bring new regulation into being, as it were. Now, the introduction states, this code was laid before Parliament in accordance with Section 23 of the Legislative and Regulatory Reform Act 2006, the Act. Regulators whose functions are specified by order under Section 24(2) of the Act must have regard to the code when developing policies and operational procedures that guide their regulatory activities. The key word there, of course, is the must. They must actually have regard to the code. Point 3 of the Regulators Code, which I will just zip down to here, the bold line there, is that point 3 of the Regulators Code is very simple and clear, and it's placed in bold on the document as one of the main headers, and it reads, 3, regulators should base their regulatory activities on risk. 3.4, as you can see here, says regulators, in making their assessment of risk, should recognise the compliance record of those they regulate, including using earned recognition approaches, and should consider all available and relevant data on compliance, including evidence of relevant external verification. So, do we feel, therefore, that the CAA in point 5.3 of the consultation provide enough evidence of risk to justify the inclusion of the remote ID system, especially the system which they're proposing? Do we feel that that evidence of phone calls from the public to police is enough to base actual regulation on? Do we feel it even provides enough evidence whatsoever? Well, how does 18,000 calls over 3 years compare to something else, to other things the police have to deal with? Let's have a look at, for instance, I don't know, 999 traffic. So phone calls that actually happen to 999. Now, this is the latest data which has actually been released on this. Now, these calls, bear in mind that obviously we're talking about 18,290 over a 3-year period. So that's an average of 508 calls nationally. So just bear that in mind. And let's actually have a look at this. So this is in 1 month, October 2023. Avon and Somerset Constabulary received 28,816 phone calls. Again, that's no evidence of actual crime happening. That doesn't necessarily mean that 28,000 criminals have been on the loose, etc. There's of course a very, very wide use for those numbers. It actually becomes even more disproportionate once you start moving down to the larger police forces. Greater Manchester had 51,000. These lasted more than 60 seconds, by the way. More than 51,000, and you come down to the Metropolitan Police Service with 203,965. And look along all these police forces, even the smaller ones with 8 or 9,999 calls just that lasted more than 60 seconds just in October 2023 alone. Now, think about that. From the point of view that we're supposed to have something which is proportionate, we're supposed to look at regulation which is proportionate against the risk. So we're talking about, as I was saying, 18,000 calls, so 500 calls a month if you take it over the 3 years. And that's nationally. So let's split that down. Let's say there's 50, 75, 100. It can't even nearly be that per police force. Then you actually look at these figures and you notice just how many 999 calls that they're handling and just how many complaints and different issues. And this is to 999. Remember, this isn't including 101. So these are the so-called emergency calls. It doesn't really feel like suddenly the big figure of storing that figure up over 3 years suddenly doesn't really feel that big. Now, I'm not saying anybody wants to see drones flying in FRZs. I don't want to even suggest for a moment that I'm suggesting that we need to see a regulatory system scrapped or anything else like that. I don't want to see criminality being used, but I don't know whether or not. I also want the regulator to show the evidence. I want them to be able to prove that as per their own the regulator code that they presumably apply to their own work. Actually, where is the evidence? Where is that evidence, proportionate evidence that it would be right? There is a high enough risk to introduce this type of regulation in particular, as in remote ID. So just this one part of the consultation. Where is the evidence, frankly, which isn't something I normally spout towards my microphone very much, is it? So FRZs in 1.4 again discusses reports, not evidence or outcomes. One ended up, of course, as we know, in terms of an FRZ incursion, which was originally reported as drones and stopped flights, as actually balloons flying across the end of the runway. And there are lots. We've had Chris, who came on from Glasgow Airport, who is an air traffic controller, and he informed us that there are it's a fairly common occurrence to have a drone flying within their FRZ, but they have a system to deal with it. So the proportionate way they deal with it is they have a traffic light system in terms of whether or not that's causing a risk where it is and that type of thing. If it's at the edge of the airfield, 50 feet, or obviously something flying over the runway, which means needs obviously immediate action taking it. And 9 UAS operating at 9,000 feet to 13,000 feet, silly, dangerous, ridiculous use of anything. I would argue probably borderline that those were actually consumer drones as such, 9,000 to 13,000, but we have seen some silly videos out there. But again, is 9 drones being flown at that proportionate in terms of showing evidence in terms of what we're actually seeing here? Now, 5.4, if I bring the report back up here and jump to page 22 once again, and we pop down to 5.4, it says here the CAA and the CAA Home Office, Department for Transport and Police maintain the view that the security benefits of remote ID will be important in preventing unlawful UAS operations and enabling UAS regulations to be enforced. Specifically, remote ID will support the police and other relevant authorities to identify malicious UAS operators and take appropriate action, enable the police to differentiate between malicious and negligent UAS operations, and focus resources on those that pose the greatest threat, and promote increased compliance by increasing accountability from UAS users. So one of the points there, the last point I have to say that I have more issue with than the other two. Okay, supporting police to and other relevant authorities to identify malicious UAS operators. Yes, I think remote ID could do that. Yes, I think there is a simpler system that could be used to achieve that same goal. Enabling the police to differentiate between malicious and negligent UAS operations and focus resources on those that pose the greatest threat. Yes, in the very, very sharp end, if we're talking, terror attack or really extreme use of drones, I can understand that. However, if that drone is, comes out of the boxes, has remote ID baked in, as it were, and is set up and is actually registered to somebody or something like that, doesn't mean that that's not going to be used by somebody they will or won't use it in a nefarious way. The same as anything else which is licensed, the same as anything else which is registered out there, including cars, etc. as well. Now, 5.5 here shows the word proportionate, which is obviously something which we read in the section of the regulators code that I read out earlier. And it says here, our view is that remote ID is a proportionate intervention due to the scale of security risks presented by UAS misuse and the low impact of remote ID to operators who fly UAS safely and securely. So they're saying there that it's a big risk, and actually they feel like remote ID is a proportionate intervention. It's a proportionate thing to bring to stop that risk, but actually that it's also it has a low impact if you are somebody who wants to fly UAS safely and securely. I'm not entirely, again, I'm not seeing the dots. I'm not seeing the evidence. I'm not seeing the dots add up as to what makes a remote ID compliant drone suddenly safe and secure. I'm not seeing those. Remote ID is an established technical solution implemented by several international governments and national aviation authorities, including in the EU, USA, Switzerland, and Japan, demonstrating the important role remote ID has in protecting airspace globally. Now, this isn't necessarily the evidence that I possibly would have stepped forward with. Firstly, the EU, yes, they have a remote ID system still in its infancy. I don't think you can use that one as any kind of evidence. Again, the USA, I think that we're aware, all of us, that there's been a lot of disquiet. There's been a lot of pushback. And in actual fact, I feel personally that the USA remote ID system has actually essentially pushed a lot of people to not want to comply. People who were trying to comply before to actually no longer comply. And of course, we have a system in the US which has essentially, to this point, it hasn't really worked because they were expecting industry to react. Of course, industry and manufacturers have to come along with any of these systems that regulators want to put into place for them to work. That hasn't happened in the USA. So we have actually still got very few numbers of, both in terms of choice and also in terms of actual numbers on shelves of remote ID modules. There's very few numbers actually out there. And therefore, they've actually postponed or essentially weakened their enforcement action until such time as that can happen. The next date is March next year in terms of when that will be a hard line. So again, I don't think the USA can be used as an example. Japan, again, has had issues with drones. They have one of the most stringent, their grammage limit in terms of regulations was 199 grams, hence they had a special Mini 2 release there when that drone came out. But again, they've had to change that to 100 grams. They've had to, obviously, they've now implemented remote ID, and they've had all sorts of issues in terms of criminality with gangs, particularly in the really built up city areas that they have. So again, remote ID has not stopped that. So to say that it's demonstrating an important role that remote ID has in protecting the airspace globally, where's the evidence? Show me the data. I honestly do not mind sitting here and supporting this kind of thing in terms of if I see it to be reasonable. I don't mind supporting a remote ID system which is practical and can actually work and does indeed focus on achieving some very worthwhile goals, because certainly there are some idiots with drones out there. There's more idiots than any of us would really like to probably admit to. But certainly the criminality side of things, we need to see more of the evidence. If there is evidence, fantastic, show us. It's a little bit like the DJI ban issue in the States, where people will say, come on, if there is a smoking gun somewhere, if there is an issue somewhere in terms of why DJI should be banned from being used by government bodies, etc., that type of thing, or even potentially consumers, as some US politicians would like to see, show us the evidence. And this is really their opportunity to do that in terms of remote ID here in the UK, and I don't think they're doing it so far. They are quoting articles, which again, I do not think a news article from the BBC is something that is evidence. What are you going to do next? Have a Geeksvana video as evidence on a consultancy? I don't see the correlation. I don't see the line of thought in terms of why that's evidence. In terms of, it can be a very good Geeksvana video, it can be a very good news article on local or national press or specialist press, but it isn't evidence. It is a news article, in my opinion. Sorry, getting a little bit animated about that one in particular. But again, showing us and actually stating remote ID is an established technical solution implemented by several international governments and national authorities, demonstrating the important role remote ID has in protecting airspace globally, when one of those that you are stating is in its infancy, and two, have had significant problems where drone rules, drone regs have actually had to be changed again, and actually in Japan's case, actually haven't dealt with the issue. Now, 5.5, as I was saying, with this proportionate part of it as well, does talk about the proportionate intervention, which is something we obviously did see over on the regulator code. But again, in that entire section of 5.5, which we've now gone over 3 times because it's annoying me slightly, I don't see anything. I don't see anything in terms of what makes this proportionate within that section. So 5.6, remote ID could also provide safety benefits through promoting increased compliance with safety requirements. Data collected by remote ID will also provide valuable safety and operational information to the CAA, allowing us to develop policy based on actual UAS operational data. Now, I don't know about you, I have to pause for 1 second to just take that in again, because every time I have, as you probably imagine, I have read this consultation many times. I have tried to take it from many different views. I've waited till I'm angry. I've waited till I'm tired to read it. I've read it first thing in the morning. I've tried to approach it at different times of day, essentially. And again, I support good regulation in the drone space. There are a lot of idiots out there flying. There are people who cannot continue flying how they fly now in the hobby, and probably on the commercial side of things, let's face it. That cannot continue as the airspace grows, as the lower airspace becomes busier, UTM and all of that stuff starts to happen. It can't continue. It's as simple as that. However, if you again just take in what 5.6 is saying there, let's just take this line for line for a second. And again, sorry if I'm harping on one particular issue there. Kayaking Graham, one of our members, just spotted your chat there. Got to go family issues, catch up later. So I hope all is well, Graham, and not too bad. And I'll see you soon. Sorry, everyone. Just want to say it's one of my regulars and one of our channel members to make sure. Hopefully everything's okay there, Graham. Do let me know. Send me a message. So yeah. So again, 5.6. Remote ID could also provide safety benefits through promoting increased compliance with safety requirements. So the safety benefit of remote ID is that, of course, it is going to increase compliance with safety requirements. Now, there is a tracked focus group, a tracking system report, which is carried out regularly by the CAA, which is a focus group where they pull people in, people that do know drones, don't know drones, that type of thing. I believe it's actually a mix of people, but don't quote me on that. But certainly there are drone operators within that group because they ask things about whether or not you're registered, etc., and that type of thing. And from that small pool of people, they basically dictate that actually the feedback they got was that for more people to register, because it was something like 52% of them weren't registered, even registered, let alone following the regulations, the existing regulations, they would need to see more draconian action taken should they be caught. So for instance, things like the fixed penalties was actually came up in the most recent report as something which people felt would be quite effective in terms of keeping people flying legally and actually wanting to go and register their drone, etc., if they haven't done so already. So that's really where this is coming from. But to say that you want to introduce remote ID, so increase regulation, so it promotes increased compliance with safety requirements, is kind of like a self-eating snake, in my opinion. The data collected by remote ID will also provide valuable safety and operational information to the CAA, allowing us to develop policy based on actual UAS operational data. Now, I don't want to be unkind about the way that this sentence has been structured. Okay, I'm a writer by trade. That is my day job. So I do look at how sentences are structured, how things are put together. Data collected by remote ID will also provide valuable safety and operational information to the CAA, allowing us to develop policy. That's not the way round it's supposed to work. You're supposed to develop policy based on actual UAS operational data that you have. So you're supposed to base it on an issue, evidence of an issue as per the regulator code. And as I've already stated, I don't see that in terms of 18,290 calls. Is not the thing to hang your hat on. If that is the strongest thing that you have in terms of saying, hey, there's been 18,000 phone calls in 3 years, something like 500 a month or something on average, in terms of issues, potential issues with drones. And again, how many of those actually ended up even being an issue, let alone actually being anything that was investigated? When it seems slightly less significant when you bear in mind that the Metropolitan Police in October dealt with nearly 204,000 999 calls that lasted 60 seconds or longer. So the proportional risk, when we come back to this word, which is certainly in your consultation several times in several areas, and in some places in this report, I actually think it is proportionate. But in this case, I don't see how you can say that it is. That's just my personal wording, my personal interpretation. Perhaps somebody else can step forward and correct that. Now, 5.8, and this is where we get to the actual technical requirements. So bear with me while I read through this particular section. I'm going to slow my voice down purposely as I've been getting into rant mode a little bit. Work through this. So we are proposing to implement remote ID through product and operational requirements. The key parts of our proposal are as follows. Technical approach. So this is an important one. Remote ID requires UAS to transmit the operator's registration number, serial number, position, altitude, route, speed, and position of the pilot or takeoff point. This data could be readable through a mobile phone near to the UAS, e.g. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, referred to as direct remote ID. Data could also be passed to a database over a network referred to as network remote ID, providing real-time and historical visibility. Our view is that hybrid remote ID, i.e. a mix of both of those, network and direct, offers the optimal solution for the UK. Now, one thing to bear in mind, of course, is that whereas network remote ID for the USA was a huge challenge because literally just the geographical size of things, you have to bear in mind that the UK, in terms of geographical size, in terms of the actual size of the UK in total, fits into Texas several times. So it's a much smaller area. It's a much, there are great areas, huge expanses of areas which are covered by fairly decent cell data, although I know a few people out there will see that. Thank you, Tazzy. He's just put a £2 super chat to say adverts popping up. We are attempting to solve this problem. I've just pressed the button to say no more adverts yet again, so hopefully that will have some kind of impact. Thank you for that, Tazzy. I appreciate it. So as it says, our view is that remote ID, a hybrid remote ID is optimal. The network remote ID would be the default approach and would enable the remote tracking of UAS and historic investigations when a connection to the network is possible. The direct element would provide a backup in areas of poor connectivity or in situations where the network is down. So it also sounds like that obviously when you don't have a network connection, it's going to store that data and then essentially upload it to the network as and when, if it ever reconnects, basically. More specifically, UAS operators would register themselves on DMARES and receive their operator ID, which is what we normally get, and a secret key used for validation. UAS operators would then set up their UAS, inputting their operator ID and secret key, and ensure the required form of remote ID is enabled based on their location for their UAS to be able to take off. For network remote ID, the UAS or ground control station would transmit a standard set of data on the UAS position and the remote pilot position to a network remote ID service provider. The remote ID service providers would then push the UAS flight data to the master data hub. UAS flight data would be ingested and stored in the master data hub and made available to authorized users where access controls permit. So they are starting there again to talk about authorized users and where access controls permit. Where direct remote ID only is permitted, the UAS would first attempt to connect to the network and, should this not be possible, would be able to take off with direct remote ID enabled. Appendix B also sets out the technical standards which we're considering for manufacturers to demonstrate compliance with this requirement. So the UAS in scope, remote ID is proposed to be mandated for all UAS with a maximum takeoff mass of 250 grams or more or under with a camera. Now, this is obviously, again, a point of difference in terms of us and the US from the point of view that in the US, there is a differential between commercial and recreational flying. You actually always technically fly under Part 107, but to fly commercially, you have your Part 107 certificate, and to fly recreationally, you're actually flying with your 107 exemption. Essentially, you're flying with an exemption to say that you are just flying a certain type of recreational drone flight. So that is again why I think we're seeing the issue from the point of view that it would also be under 250 grams with a camera in both the open specific category, because again we don't have that differential. So it's just the size of drone, that's it. There isn't in the US it's actually keep wanting to call it America, sorry, in the US it's actually registered or not registered, and of course the sub 250 recreational don't need to be registered. So but we don't have that delineation basically. And it continues, this recognizes the safety and security risks from these UAS and the increasing technical capabilities of lightweight UAS with cameras in particular. C0 UAS without cameras and C4 UAS would not be in the scope of product requirements. So okay, so the very smallest ones and then the C4 ones, which are obviously going to be flown in a different way, are not going to be required to have it. So that's a very, very limited use case though. Pretty much, I can almost guarantee 99% of anybody watching this would require remote ID to be active when this comes in. Operational requirements. UAS operators and remote pilots would also be subject to operational requirements to ensure UAS in scope are operated with active remote ID. This aims to provide an additional layer of assurance that remote ID is being used. So operators of privately built UAS weighing 250 grams or more, or with a camera, would be required to have active remote ID delivered via an add-on module. There we have the add-on module thing again, which is a joy to see, having seen so much success with the modules over in the US. Unless a model aircraft exemption has been granted, as described below in paragraph 5.8, subsection 8, which we will come on to. On-device enforcement. We propose to implement technical mitigations that ensure remote ID is active before the drone takes flight. This aims to prevent unlawful drone users from disabling UAS before operations and undermining the security benefits of remote ID. We recognise concerns raised around how network remote ID would work in areas of poor connectivity. And as they said before, a proposal is we're considering to define remote ID zones where the US would require active network remote ID to fly in certain geographic areas. In other areas where security risks are lower and mobile connectivity may be poor, operations would be allowed with direct remote ID enabled, provided that the US must first attempt to enable network remote ID. So if you are flying in a zone that, as they're proposing here, that it has been identified as a network remote ID area, if for whatever reason you can't get a signal, and signals, drone flyers, we understand about why sometimes you can't get signals and why some days you have a fantastic signal, some days you don't. It can be all sorts of environmental factors, all sorts of factors. But actually, if you're in a network remote ID area and it's identified as such, you really do have to gain a signal before you're able to fly. So that whole thing of falling back to the direct remote ID, the localized remote ID system, wouldn't actually work for you, basically, if you're in one of those zones, which I think is a really, really important point to make. Enforcement. To promote compliance with these requirements, it is necessary for the police to have the ability to take action against operators who do not comply with remote ID or who attempt to tamper with or spoof a remote ID transmission. To enable enforcement of remote ID requirements, we expect to create new offences in legislation for non-compliance with these requirements. So I suppose if we're going to have remote ID as a thing, you would expect there to be some kind of legislation to enhance enforcement. Okay, this is an interesting one, and this is one of the sections which we need to pay particular attention to. The call for input highlighted concerns from UAS users regarding the impact of remote ID on data privacy. Our approach to data privacy would be compliant with the Data Protection Act 2018 and therefore GDPR principles. For those of you watching in the States, we have some very finite and particular data protection laws here in the UK, some of which have been sort of held over from the EU times as well. But you have to be very, very careful how you handle people's personal data. So it says here, more specifically, we will ensure that personally identifiable information, such as operator ID, is not made available to the general public and is protected by robust security controls. Under network remote ID, service providers would not display the pilot or ground control station's location. This would be viewable by authorized persons only, such as the police. The pilot or ground control station data would be visible to those able to receive and interpret direct remote ID data, as indeed it is not technically possible to encrypt this data to only be viewable by certain user groups. The pilot's location will therefore only be available publicly if network remote ID is not enabled. We'll come back to that in just one section, because I know lots of you watching are going to be pointing something out to me there. It is proposed that authorised organisations such as the police and prisons would have access to remote ID data, with the police having access to operator details when necessary. To address data privacy concerns raised in the call for input, we are proposing to work with stakeholders to develop and publish a data privacy, security and access policy. We expect this to include details on what information is shared with who, how data is communicated, the security mitigations used to prevent unauthorized access to data, and the requirements to protect the storage of personal data. Now, that of course is very important, especially that last paragraph, and that has to be in place, let's face it, before remote ID can actually be a thing here in the UK. If you're not getting things right from a privacy point of view, then it's not going to work. Frankly, you really do have to get that. Now, one of my problems with this, and as I said, I'd come back to this section where it's describing it. One of my problems is, he says, that under network remote ID, service providers would not display the pilot or ground control location. So where the pilot is or the controller would not be there for network remote ID, and it would be viewable by authorized persons only, such as the police. And there are arguments that in itself, let alone the actual identity, i.e. through an operator ID, etc. But actually, this kind of personal data could actually be covered under data protection as well. And that's something which I think far more intelligent and far more knowledgeable people than myself need to have a look at and argue, because of course you could be turning that drone on in your own home, which in itself could actually be argued as starting to identify somebody. You're turning your drone on to actually carry out an update, etc. And you're connected to the Wi-Fi, etc. Or you could be turning it on to put batteries in or change the cards over, and you don't have connection. And then actually you are then actually transmitting all of your data. I would also be interested to know, and it's something which I have raised with a solicitor that we work with, in terms of whether or not this part of it, where you fall back to the direct remote ID signal and everything's sent, because obviously technically it's not possible to encrypt the data, and that would be viewable to stop it being only viewable by certain groups. It's kind of, in one sense, they're saying we understand that this is a privacy issue, so we're taking steps and we're going to make sure that only the police can find out the details when it's correct that they should find those details out, etc. And prisons get access to certain levels and that type of thing for obviously people flying drugs into prisons, etc. But then it's stated that actually if you're not in a network remote ID area, you don't get that kind of privacy coverage. So again, this is one of the points of this consultation, in particular to remote ID, that causes me a bit of confusion and that we need more information on. We need more information on the evidence around things, not just these, frankly, in the significance of the national numbers of phone calls. And I'm sorry, CAA, but you used telephone calls in your evidence. So obviously I'm going to bring that up as well. The fact that, as I say, the Met had 204,999 calls lasting more than 60 seconds in October alone of this year, let alone, if we added up 3 years of 999 calls, it is an insignificant amount in comparison to the data. So i.e. the risk is different. So you started that particular fight, as it were. But with this one as well, I'm very concerned, because you're saying in one sense that in the report that your data and privacy, security and access is very important to you. And it is great to hear that. We had the same feedback from Mark Worry from the CAA in our interview, which obviously went out in a video here on Geeksvana. And we had other feedback from the CAA later on after that regarding whether or not that was correct or not. But anyway, that's a whole other story that the consultation has eclipsed. But certainly the fact that direct remote ID will still transmit all the data that you in this actually admit that shouldn't be sent out to other people, sent out to all users, is that not an issue in itself? Is that not something that is some kind of, to me, I don't see how that's actually feasible, that you can state that under network remote ID, you see the issue. And actually, we understand that you drone flyers are concerned in terms of what's actually happening here, and we're going to protect your data. We're going to have these levels. Great. It sounds fantastic. It's certainly what I think, if that could have happened, and it can't happen, unfortunately, on localized remote ID, direct remote ID, that it would have been very popular in the US if they weren't showing the pilot location. It's a huge and significant issue that so many pilots and organizations, professional bodies even, have with the remote ID system that's currently in place in the US. But to say it, that you understand it, that it's going to work on the Data Protection Act and therefore GDPR principles, and I know you're saying that that's things like operator ID, etc., not being made visible. But as I say, there are nuances to that I'm not sure everybody's fully worked out, and I don't expect you to have fully worked those out yet, but they need looking into more, because I don't see how you can say you understand and that you're going to restrict it for network remote ID side of things and not the direct remote ID. That does start to tell me as well that if they see this as the solution, and they're talking about areas that are direct remote ID and network remote ID, it would be good to have a percentage. It would be good to have, a theoretical percentage based on the technology and the standards, as far as what percentage of the country do you expect to be network remote ID insistent, compliant, i.e. that have to have network remote ID working for the drone to even take off. That will be a very important question as well. And by the way, I am putting all these questions to the CAA, hopefully in an upcoming interview, but also actually certainly directly in writing so that we can get those back fairly quickly as well. And I'm raising a lot of the questions that everybody's raised as well in our recent videos. So that'll certainly be coming up. So that was that part of it. So legacy UAS. The current operational requirements allow legacy, i.e. non-class marked UAS, to be operated in the A1 and A3 subcategory indefinitely. Our view is that these regulations for legacy UAS would undermine the benefits of remote ID by allowing malicious operators to operate lawfully without remote ID indefinitely, and by reducing the ability for police to differentiate between lawful, negligent, and criminal operations. We're therefore proposing to require legacy UAS to be operated with remote ID from the 1st of January 2028 onwards, excluding UAS sub 250 without cameras. This requirement could be met through either remotely upgrading a UAS with inactive remote ID capabilities, or through users attaching a compliant remote ID add-on module to their device. And that's an interesting one in itself, because there is a chart on the in terms of the legacy drones side of things on this report, and obviously sub 250 is really the one that's going to be surviving as a legacy in the A1 airspace, but it will need remote ID. And if it's a legacy drone that's sort of out now or just before, it's possibly that it will need a module and therefore may actually push it over the 250. So then it won't be in the near or over airspace anymore, the A1 airspace essentially. Mike Drennan, thank you so much, one of our longest term channel members. Thank you very much for the $10 super chat. I really appreciate it. Cheers from the Netherlands. You're over there, are you? Fantastic. Where I may or may not be currently sober. Thanks for all the information you provide. Cheers, Mike. I have a feeling that that's a negative on the sober parts. I hope you're having a wonderful time. So next up is model aircraft. We recognise the good safety record of model aircraft flying in the UK and the importance of model aircraft to many hobbyists. However, our view is that a blanket, unconstrained remote ID exemption for all model aircraft flying would make UAS regulations challenging to enforce and create inconsistent security outcomes due to the wide range of locations and aircraft currently used for model aircraft flying. Our aim is therefore to find a proportionate approach that supports the model aircraft community to fly safely and securely without undermining the security benefits that we aim. I'm actually just going to press a button here to make sure that we don't get ads again, because that time has gone down. Our aim is therefore to find, yes, a proportionate approach. We are proposing for safe and secure model aircraft flights to be exempt from remote ID requirements. Under our proposed approach, model aircraft flights would be exempt from remote ID if the aircraft meets the CAA's definition and specification for exempt model aircraft, the pilot and UAS remain within the bounds of a designated model aircraft flying site authorised by the CAA based on proximity to urban, sensitive or restricted sites, and, so this is an and, not an or, the flight takes place within a model aircraft club with an authorisation granted under Article 16 of the UK EU 2019-947, so good old Article 16. This approach is similar to that taken by the Federal Aviation Authority in the USA. In practice, the detailed definition of model aircraft and criteria for designated flying zones would need to be established in parallel to this consultation in collaboration with model aircraft stakeholders. These would be developed to ensure that flights taking place without remote ID are limited to locations and aircraft that pose a sufficiently low risk, security risk. Where these conditions are not met, model aircraft flights would be expected to meet the same regulatory requirements as legacy UAS, i.e. to have active remote ID delivered via a remote ID add-on module, unless it's less than 250 without a camera. Under these proposals, model aircraft that fly at low-risk club or association sites and meet the definition of an exempt model aircraft would not be impacted by remote ID. We expect for this approach to be implemented from the 1st of January 2028 onwards, aligning to our proposals for legacy UAS. Now, this section here in particular with the model aircraft, it kind of has a freer feeling to it, doesn't it, from the point of view of the US side of things? But it's essentially what they're saying is it kind of goes a little step further, because in the US, as a recreational flyer, you have to choose a CBO. So let's say I'm going to call the BMFA a CBO for this. It's a community-based organization. You have to choose a set of their guidelines to fly to, and if you're ever approached by police and that type of thing, you'd have to be a member of them. So you can fly to FPV, FC, the Freedom Coalition's safety guidelines in the US in a freer, but not actually be a member and paying anybody any money or anything else like that. However, what it appears to be stating in this report from the UK CAA is that you will actually be flying, because it says on the part regarding here on the B2C, it says restriction says and the flight takes place within a model aircraft club with an authorization granted under Article 16. To have Article 16 authorization, of course, you need to be a member of the BMFA or FPV UK. There was a Scottish one. I'm not sure if that actually has the Article 16 permission anymore, or operational authorization. So you would actually have to be a paying member of one of those organizations flying in one of their fields. And of course, have it as a model be something that's recognized as a model aircraft. What that definition is going to be will be an interesting one for sure, in terms of how that might impact other things, as well as including, of course, FPV flights as well. Now, it says that it's a similar approach taken in the States, obviously, with things like freers, etc., which I can see. But as I say, there is that very clear differential in terms of actually the individual cost that it's going to have. So it will increase costs for model aircraft flyers, of which there are plenty who just go out and enjoy their drones, and will just go out to a field, will just go out and actually just enjoy what they're doing as a hobby, etc., without actually having a membership to one of those types of organizations. Okay, I'm going to head over to the chat and have a quick look at what people have been saying across there. Do let me know in the comments if you have any particular comments, etc. SJM Drones and Media, I've managed very well for the past 7 years without it. And yeah, it's something which there's a lot in the consultation that we have to face up to as a hobby and as commercial operators in the open category. We have to face up to the fact that the airspace is changing. We have to face up to the fact that there is going to be no golden bullet that suddenly saves the hobby in terms of keeps us flying exactly as we are now. Now, that's a mixture, in my opinion, of various, and you can quiz me on the percentages if you want to go even in even deeper dive at some point. But it's some kind of mix of greater use of the lower airspace, so the fact that there is going to be a lot more unmanned flights happening, that there is also the fantasy land in the middle there of unmanned flights, the likes of air taxis, etc., which are unlikely to be regular services and regularly zipping in and out of airports and picking people up from down here in Surrey and whisking me off to Heathrow Airport, etc. That's still a bit fantasy land in the middle, but we still have to deal with that almost as a reality in terms of the lower airspace future regulation. And of course, there has to be the factor of now, I'm not saying it's unsafe, but there are a lot of people who fly outside of the existing regulations, even, let alone these proposed regulations. And the enforcement argument, the argument in terms of government, the argument in terms of regulator and police is that it is their job to get people to comply with these regulations, so they're going to hit with a harder and harder hammer. I'm not saying I agree with it at all. I'm not saying I'm not putting everybody in the same boat of all of those stakeholders named, that everybody feels the same way, but that is, in some degree or other, that is a factor. And of course, there are just the straight idiots out there, the people who abuse our hobby and who damage it every day. But again, in my opinion, very small numbers. Otherwise, I suspect, and chat, you'll have to agree with me or disagree with me on this one. I suspect that if there was more clear evidence of the problem that drones are causing in the UK airspace, then actually we'd see it in this consultation. They wouldn't be relying on sticking things in about the NPCC national police figures and BBC articles, etc. They would love, I'm sure, to bring that to the fore. Now, there are factors in that in terms of the evidence. There will be evidence that they can't show us for security reasons. There absolutely will be. There will be evidence that from an intelligence point of view, from a tactics point of view, they cannot show us. And some of those are the more serious and are the most serious implications of nefarious drone use. But equally, if there was more data out there of what's happening, then they should be bringing it to us. So I almost feel like we're in a bit of a void where we're in the middle, and I'm not sure which way this should really push in terms of and how we sort ourselves out of this void, because we're in the void of no data for all sorts of reasons, and that's also because at the moment for the police to prosecute a nefarious drone flyer, someone doing that, it's a fairly major deal in evidence gathering, in bringing a prosecution against that person, proving someone's flying beyond the visual line of sight within certain margins, I'm sure is very difficult in a court of law. Proving it when they're a mile and a half away from their starting position, I'm sure is pretty easy, which is why, the cases that we do see go to court, the fines that we do see happening, are pretty extreme cases, people flying close to World War II fighters and bombers, etc., and that type of thing. Those are the ones which obviously we have seen being prosecuted because they're pretty clear breaches of legislation, and therefore something which the police and the court system can enforce and prosecute. There is, however, a lot of other misuse of drones that does happen out there as a hobby. We have to admit that to an extent amongst ourselves. And we have to face up to that a little bit as well. I'm not saying that's unsafe flight, but it's not to code, it's not to regulation, it's not even necessarily to legislation. That is harder to prove because, as I say, it's harder to bring cases. I think the implementation of fixed penalties is going to change that world a little bit, and we're going to see a lot more people issued fixed penalties in terms of their drone flight and in terms of breaches of regulation legislation at a significant level, from the point of view that it will be a code. So BVLOS will be a certain code, etc., that type of thing. Or it's not BVLOS, it's actually, because it's not actually BVLOS almost makes it sound like it's actually a little bit more legitimate. Thank you, Amok Time Flies, for your £5 super chat. You provide such a valuable service with all of the stuff, all of this stuff. My opinion, costly, unsustainable, and likely to kill the hobby. Have a beverage on me. One thing I would say is that, and thank you, Amok Time Flies, one of our channel members and a long-time viewer and somebody who comes into a lot of our lives. So thank you for that as well. But one thing I would say, and your comment sort of brings this up in my mind a little bit as well, that we have to also keep our feet on the ground from the point of view that the enforcement side of things is very important from this point of view. Even with all of this in place, I feel personally, with the experience that I've had in terms of speaking to police at national level, to the fact that I'm on an independent advisory group for the NPCC counter drones team, and so I am exposed, shall I say, more than the average drone flyer to the policing system in terms of enforcement against illegal drone flight, etc. That this still won't be a situation where suddenly drone users is top of the police's priority. And it's the same in the US, that suddenly remote ID issues, etc., or somebody flying their drone in the middle of a field somewhere in Wales or the middle of Missouri. I'm thinking about you, John Coopy, in the States. You sprung to mind, sir. Flying his FPV quads. That's not necessarily who the police are going to be, going after and enforcing, etc. Of course, we're going to get headlines of people that will happen in, because that it always happens, especially with new legislation. But yeah, we have to keep our feet on the ground in terms of what the actual process will be in terms of enforcement and in terms of how that will get rolled out. And to me, that's just as important to find out as this process unravels, and I intend to do that as what the actual regulation and legislation is going to be. So you can shoot me now. PD Tech, good to see you. Will RID stop someone with nefarious intentions? Absolutely not. Yeah, no. And I said in my video regarding the F1 flight that happened in Vegas that nearly 50,000 of you have watched now. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it, for supporting that little video. I still see remote ID in a lot of cases as something which is going to help in terms of the investigation afterwards. Yes, there's going to be situations where a drone, particularly things like prisons, for instance, yes, network remote ID will probably have an impact there, because again, you're going to see the drone flying towards you as one that someone's just bought from Argos. They haven't done all the correct things. It may not even take off, but even if they've used a hack and they're using third-party software, etc., it's going to be very obvious very quickly to the drone detection system in place in that prism that is a potentially nefarious drone, and they can go and concentrate on it. Whereas the others flying in the area, all with remote ID singing away, are ones that they might not go on. Now, there's obviously complications and what ifs, etc., to that as well. So I think there is a certain extent where it does start to narrow that down, but I'm not again completely convinced. Lindsay Hayes, hi Sean, hi Lindsay, good to see you. I can't see the point of this. Honest folk will obey the law. Bad actors will lie, just as they use false reg plates on cars and don't insure them. It's a waste of effort. Yeah, I both agree and disagree with that, genuinely, because one of the things you have to bear in mind as well is that every criminal in the UK is probably going to hate me for saying this, but your average criminal actually isn't that bright. Especially the ones that get caught, shall we say. I'm sure there's lots of very bright ones that have never been caught. And anyway, we won't go down the whole existential crisis there of identifying who is a criminal and who isn't in society. Let's not stop, Sean. It's a drone channel. But I do agree with you that honest folk will obey the law, bad actors will lie, just these false reg plates on cars, etc., and don't show them, because the criminals are criminals. They're always going to be happening. But there is also an extent that, in certain circumstances, a good remote ID system, and I believe a good remote ID system is possible here in the UK, in particular here in the UK for certain reasons. So I think there is a balance there. I'm not convinced by this system and by this setup, both from the point of view of having network areas, non-network areas, data being handed out, data not being handed out. What if you turn your drone on to update it, or turn your drone on and you're not in a network remote ID area where you live, which is pumping out pumping out the information, which is still, to an extent, it's associating that signal with that address. So there is a level of personal identification, in my opinion. I know that might not actually meet the legal definition, but certainly I think morally that there is an issue there. But also from the point of view that you're giving one set of standards to people that are in areas that have network remote ID access, and others that don't, that are flying in areas that don't. So I'm not sure where the differential is there, in terms of, is it fair to stop one set of pilots who are just as safe and legal missing out on that protection? I'm not sure from that point of view. I think there could be a way of doing that. CAA, if you're interested, copyright Sean Hickey. I think there is a way that you can actually do that, which will be fairer to people in terms of pilot location and that type of thing. Will RID put you as pilots and your gear at risk of attack or intimidation or assault? Yes, absolutely. You'll be at risk every time you fly. One of the things I would bear in mind, and we need to look at in more detail at the standards, etc., for this. And network remote ID is slightly different. It would be interesting to see if network remote ID can populate a flight radar style app or not. Now, they're saying, of course, that there won't be information released to the public on network remote ID in terms of operator ID, etc., but some information will, which I presume is to also enable the general public to feel slightly better about the drone that's flying over their head. But where is that line? Will we have an app that will have, very much like Flight Radar 24, where you can see all the planes coming in and out, where actually you can see all of that data where drones are? Will it be, will the access to even network remote ID be localized? There are a few questions there that I have, which I think are really, really important ones, frankly. Drone Views Media, good to see you. Great to see so many of the names that we've seen around the channel for several years. It's been years that Geeksvana has been going, but thank you everybody for all your support. What I hate about remote ID is the temptation for mission creep. They'll keep on adding more and more regulation and no-fly restrictions. Well, yeah, I mean, we do obviously have the new flight restrictions around prisons, which are coming into effect. And we do, again, the one that I think people aren't really paying attention to enough, which is the National Security Act, which is going to allow things like defence, and certain police stations will certainly fall under it, which will then become flight restriction zones as well. So I do understand and I do sympathise with the mission creep, because again, for every stakeholder that I come across that I feel is positive and that I feel wants to support the hobby and wants to see people enjoy their hobby and completely and utterly understands exactly how important it really truly is to some people, I do meet them. I do meet regulators. I do meet other stakeholders, important stakeholders within drones nationally, who have those feelings and do understand. But for every one of those, I meet another that I think, okay, you just want to get rid of drones, basically. You just want to get rid of consumer drones. Again, just my opinion. Having a look down here. Cheeky Oscar, sorry, a bit late. Now 6 minutes behind the live. Excellent. So you're probably back in one of my rants there, but there we go. Nothing Big Brother poking, nothing but Big Brother poking a very large nose into your business. It's got nothing to do with safety. Fully agree with geo zones around sensitive areas. It will become the ULEZ of the sky. Yeah, an interesting position to take on that, I have to say. So Dan the Drone Man, good to see you, sir. Hope you're well. One of our members answering PD Tech and saying, personally, I think it's taken too long to get to the point where UAS owners need to do a flyer ID test. This should have been mandatory for all drone users years ago. Now, my feelings are twofold, and as with many of my feelings, you might expect, as someone that's not involved, but involves himself in drone regulations as heavily as I do, that my live theory and my live opinions on all sorts of subjects varies and evolves. And I have slightly differing opinions on DeMares depending on when you would have asked me over the last couple of years. My existing position is that, yes, I think it's important for everybody that flies a drone to take a flyer ID test. Certainly above Whoop. I think Whoop and below, toys, those, no. But I think, yes, someone that's flying a Mini 3, like the one over my shoulder on the desk there, sub 250 camera drone, should take a flyer ID test. I think that was an error, personally, in the original EASA regulations. I understand there's a whole privacy thing, and it was the camera that it was only the camera that made the operator ID originally applicable, etc., and that type of thing. But I think it's reasonable. I also don't believe that the flyer ID or the operator ID does anything apart from essentially sign legal responsibility over to the end user. So essentially, when you're stood in court, or you're stood in front of a police officer getting a fixed penalty, you've got a flyer ID, you've got an operator ID, therefore you've passed the test, you shouldn't have been flying beyond visual line of sight, you should have X, Y, Z. And so I feel like it has more to do with that than anything else, because I'm not sure what studying for the flyer ID test teaches you in terms of safety and in terms of how to operate your drone safely. It teaches you a few facts and figures that you can remember, and then sorry, the microphone hit there, you either decide to stick to or not. But I don't know how and whether or not it's evolved enough. Sorry to take such a long meandering journey away from your point there, Dan the Drone Man, which I do actually agree with. And a few more just before we head off into the sunset. Thank you very much for the amazing numbers that we've had watching. If you wouldn't mind, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit the like button before you leave as well this evening. It would really help the video, and it therefore helps the channel as well. Tazzy, many of the proposals are clearly based on pressure than facts. The CAA starting to bow, starting to go down the wrong road and have bowed. Okay, yeah, I can understand that point completely. Don't 100% agree with it, but I do understand it. I think that we have to remember, the same as the FAA in the States, that the CAA as a regulatory body are, of course, an entity. Yes, there's an independence there. Yes, there's a regulators code, that type of thing. But the key way, the core way to try and influence that kind of what happens at that level is through politics and voting and being active in that side of things, speaking to your local MP about drones, etc. That is important. It is wholeheartedly important. Mr. Snowman, good to see you. As of 30th of April 2022, there are 181,166 registered drone pilots in the United Kingdom, and they are saying that 10% are causing a problem. Well, interestingly, it isn't even necessarily a little bit like where in the consultation the CAA talk about the fact that they need data, so that they need that data to come back in. You've kind of got that situation with this from the point of view that they don't know what they don't know, because in their own focus groups, their own reports that are tracked year on year, it's something like they think 53% of people who fly drones aren't registered. So going by that, there's probably closer to something like 300,000 drone flyers out there. So to say, in actual fact, the percentage of that are causing problems are actually probably even smaller than that percentage. But of course, it's very difficult as well to expect a regulator to have a conversation and include people who aren't even following the rules that they're there to enforce, basically, as well. That's just a situational observation. I'm not supporting one side or the other with that particular comment. Rue getting on with it, love the username. If a bad Thai wants to break the law, if a bad guy wants to break the law with a drone, do you think remote ID will stop them? No, but I think it will catch more, and I think it will in instances which I still think are too few to personally think are too few to have this level of remote ID legislation regulation come into place. I still think it isn't enough. It isn't proportionate. I think there is a proportionate system which could come in, which could still help with those situations personally. Drones View Media, people make genuine mistakes. If they start issuing fines on the basis of negligent flights, it will be a bad day. And, you know, again, most situations do get, most situations, or many situations, do get dealt with, as far as I'm aware, with education, etc. Partly, again, because of the mountain that there is to actually bring a prosecution sometimes. But, you know, those fines, again, they're not going to have them particularly borderline, in my opinion. They're not going to want to give out 10,000 fines and to have 9,900 successful appeals on them. So there's going to have to be some fairly clear issue, some fairly clear breach, in my opinion, for those fixed penalties to work, which are still coming soon, as far as I'm aware. Okay. Excellent. Well, that will be it for this evening. Again, thank you for the super chats, and thank you for all of our wonderful channel members that have joined us. Again, if you are new here, if you haven't come along to this channel before, do hit the subscribe button to get more updates on drone content, drone news, etc. as they come. It can be anything from deeper dives and shorter update videos on things like these consultations from regulators around the world, all the way through to things like the F1 news story that we brought you last week as well. And on that note, I will see you all next time on Geeksvana. Thanks so much again for everybody joining us, and hit the like button on your way out. I really appreciate it if you did. Thank you. Bye-bye.